One of the biggest reasons for the decline in faith, essentially for the expansion of atheism and decline of faith among the youth, among the millennial generation of 20-somethings in the United States, one of the biggest reasons for this has been a perception that Christian theology, that, Christianity as a religion, views certain actions which have no victims, certain victimless, harmless, consensual actions, to be unethical and immoral. The two big ones are like homosexuality and premarital sex, but there's some others. But in essence, like the youth who kind of grew up in Western decadence and with a lot of civil libertarian leanings and stuff, and the era of sexual liberation, they look at this idea that Christianity says that these actions, such as, people like two men having sex, or like people just having consensual sex before getting married, things like this, they say these actions, they don't hurt anybody, but Christianity says it's wrong, therefore Christianity is stupid, I'm going to go become a science atheist, right? That's an extremely common thing in today's day. That's a huge, huge cultural reality in the United States, and I'm sure all over the Western world. And I think there's lots and lots of people out there who are open to the supernatural, who are open to a theistic viewpoint, but find, the kind of puritanical absurdity of Christianity supposedly saying that, like, homosexuality and other consensual sexual acts are immoral, find that so off-putting that they, just say, screw religion, right? Here's the thing, though. If you interpret Christianity properly, if you actually understand the verses in context and what everything's saying, it's clear that Christianity really isn't saying that things like homosexuality and premarital sex and all that are inherently immoral. In many ways, Christianity is perfectly, or maybe not perfectly, but relatively consistent with a libertarian perspective of morality, with a perspective that, consensual acts aren't, evil, even though they're consensual. And so I wanted to go through some verses to kind of illustrate that, and I think that puts a nice bow on kind of this YouTube ministry. We'll see. So let's go over this again. Let's go over how morality is defined in the New Testament. And I'm not going to get too much into like Old Testament law and then Jesus dying and faith and all that, because that's kind of that's more of the technical knit and grit. I'm going to get into what the New Testament, both in the epistles, in Paul's writings, as well as in the Gospels, says about morality. We look here at James 2:8. It talks about the royal law found in the scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. If you keep this, you're doing it right. So essentially that if you just love your neighbor as yourself, which is, standard secular humanism, pretty much everyone agrees with that. Standard humanism, you're a good person. That's essentially what it's saying, right? And even Jesus, even in the gospel era when Jesus was only speaking to the Jews, really, not necessarily the Gentiles, like in the Paul epistles era, you have Jesus here, someone asks him, what's the greatest commandment, right? And he says, of course, love God with all your heart and your soul. And then the second, that's the first greatest, of course. And then the second one is love your neighbor as yourself. And he says all the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. And then we go further into Paul's writings. We look at Romans and Galatians, and we have this here, one of my favorite parts. It essentially is the not 10 commandments of the Old Testament, but essentially the one commandment of the New Testament. And of course, we have the beauty right here where it says, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this here sounds really, really libertarian, actually. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And of course down here we have, basically the same thing repeated. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But really one of the most powerful things that we're seeing here is we're seeing Paul, speaking, God speaking through Paul in Romans. We're seeing Paul saying, And, these commandments and all the other commands, they're summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, that word love there comes from the Greek word agape, which isn't like romantic love. It's kind of a universalistic, human love, like the love you're supposed to have for your enemies or everybody else, right? So all commandments can be summed up in one command: love your neighbor as yourself. The basis of morality is, basically regarding others properly. That's morality, right? So, with this understanding, Paul unambiguously states this. So this is morality as understood in a New Testament context. So from that perspective, we can know that unambiguously a specific action, can only be considered a quote-unquote immoral action, or I guess we can use the word sin, though sin is broader, but in a broader idea. But let's say an immoral action can only really be defined as an action that violates love your neighbor as yourself. So essentially an unloving action to either your neighbor or arguably also yourself. So an unloving action to your neighbor or yourself is immoral on some level. Yes, although, so that's where it's not maybe 100% libertarian. But, nonetheless, okay, so let's define morality that way, right? Which is perfectly reasonable idea of morality. And now let's look at this. There's a few verses from the New Testament that are used to argue that, homosexuality and other consensual acts are immoral. Let's just look at some of them, right? Let's look at some of them and then understand them in this unambiguous framework of love thy neighbor as themselves that has been stated. So, here in 1 Thessalonians 4, it says, it's essentially saying you should avoid sexual immorality, you should control your body, and that no one should take advantage of a brother or sister. And then down here, it's talking about bad stuff, and it mentions, this is translated from the Greek word, something like archeseconite, or something like that, or essentially a word meaning like sodomite or homosexual. So we do have a verse up here where we talk about quote-unquote sexual immorality, and then we have a word down here where we have a reference to homosexuality in the context of the original Greek. And I want to point out something really interesting in the verse up top. It says here that no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. In the context of what we know to be unambiguous about New Testament morality, that all of God's commands are summed up in love thy neighbor as thyself, love God, love thy neighbor as thyself, right? So if we know that's the case, we have to assume that inasmuch as sexual immorality or whatever else of that nature is referenced in the New Testament, it has to be in the only referring to actions that are unloving, right? Only referring to actions that violate morality. So the mistake that a lot of Christian theologians have made is it was a kind of a chicken and the egg problem. They said, oh, these actions are mentioned with immorality, therefore the totality of these actions are immoral. But in reality, the only logical conclusion is that inasmuch as quote-unquote sexual acts are being mentioned in the New Testament in the context of, like immoral stuff, or inasmuch as even homosexuality is mentioned in the New Testament in the context of being something wrong, we have to assume that it's only referring to samples of, or that it's only referring to acts that contain wrongness. Wrongness not defined as the acts themselves, but wrongness defined as not loving your neighbor as yourself. So, quote-unquote sexual immorality or immoral homosexuality or any kind of immorality like that of a sexual nature is only those acts of a sexual nature which are immoral, which are unloving. Therefore, the possibility that there exists, I guess, loving, nice, happy, kind, consensual sex that is not wrong is perfectly viable, because any act that is of love thy neighbor as thyself can theoretically be moral. So homosexuality, whatever other sexual act, I'm assuming, consensual sex and all that, whatever like that is, by definition, would be moral if it's loving, and in as much as it's not loving, it's immoral, and that's all that this can be referring to. Just going down here, we have some more examples, and I just want to give this idea. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, etc., right? So if something produces goodness, produces love, peace, and happiness, then it's moral. If it doesn't, It's not moral. You can't say these things are inherently immoral.